Right, thank you for everyone coming today, and thank you for our speakers for coming as well. I'm Jake Sumner, one of the SERA co-chairs, and you are at A Home Shouldn't Cost the Earth, How Labour Can Address the Housing and Climate Crises event. So if you thought you were another event, stay because this will be better. So just for the format, we'll hear from all our speakers and our expert panel, and then we'll open up for questions. We'll try and be wrapped up no later than 2 p.m. It is being filmed and streamed on our website, so don't hold back on any of the points you might want to make, but be aware that there's a wider audience than just this room. And on that note, please tweet. There's been lots of tweeting throughout this conference, and some of the hashtags we're using are hashtag climate crisis, hashtag lab19, and hashtag SERA lab19. So just a little bit about SERA. We are Labour's environment campaign, we're a social society, and we are linked to the Labour Party. We help shape, we're independent of, but linked to the Labour Party. We have events like this and others. We have new ground publication. We try and shape and influence Labour policy at all levels. When we're current, and there's just been debated on the floor a whole motion around the environment as we speak. It reflects, I think, the climate emergency we face, and that has been a theme throughout all of our events. There's more details on SERA around and on our website, and please join if you're not a member. We're also hosting it with Labour Housing Group as well, and other social societies, so that's great, and we work together across the social societies on joint interests. We're having this event, also we're our partners with this event, the Federation of Master Builders and CPRE, and so thank you very much for supporting this event. So just briefly, and I'll introduce all the speakers as I take them in turn, but I just want to just lay out a little bit of context first of all. The conference is perhaps one of the most important we've held, and as I said, there's a big theme throughout lots of the conference programme, debate today around climate change and the climate emergency, and we're at a crisis point. I think everyone realises that, and we need action, and our theme, a rapid response. But we're here today to talk about two crises. We've got the environmental crisis, climate crisis, also the housing crisis. And we know that we don't have enough homes. We know rents are rising. We know there's an affordability challenge, and there's a homeless crisis as well. And I'm sure we'll pick that up. But at the same time, we need to build, at the same time as building lots of new homes and retrofitting homes, we also need to make sure that they meet the zero carbon and targets that we must meet as a country. And so how do we do it? How do we achieve that? And how do we make sure those new homes, and how do we retrofit homes to get to the standard? And how do we talk about those benefits that will come from that? So anyway, that's just a bit of context, and that's some of the themes that some people will be talking about here. And I'm just going to ask Alex Cunningham to lead off. He's the Labour Shadow Minister for Housing, the MP for Stockton North, and also set up and chairs the all-party parliamentary group on carbon capture and storage. And so, Alex, over to you.
Thank you very much for that. And I suppose maybe some of you are surprised to see both Helen and I still here, given what's happened over the last 2.5 or 3 hours. But I'm sure we'll both be in a different place tomorrow morning come 11:30 and having the opportunity to hold Boris Johnson to account. That's assuming he bothers to burn the carbon and find his way back from New York overnight. So that's something perhaps we can look forward to, although we're sorry to see that your conference has been somewhat curtailed as a result of that. Thank you for, to our host today and the opportunity to speak here. Building genuinely affordable homes is at the forefront of, our housing policy. We want to build 1 million over the next 10 years. And that'll go a long way to solving some of the social housing waiting lists problem that we have. But also, the stretch to that is actually ending homelessness and rough sleeping in our community. We're also going to stop that sell-off of the 50,000 social rented homes a year by suspending the right to buy. We'll be ending all conversions to affordable rent and scrapping the government's plans to force councils to sell the best of their homes. But we will make sure that they can do the job properly. Local authorities and housing associations will give them the powers, we'll give them the funding and the flexibilities to build houses at scale. But we'll also transform the planning system with a new duty to deliver affordable homes, to make land available much more cheaply and end that viability loophole which lets developers off the hook when it comes to providing sufficient affordable homes on their particular area. Of course, homes need to be in the right places. They need to be places where the people have got access to services, to schools, to health services, to transport. And we have examples in my constituency. Some of you, when I look around the room, I can see one or two faces. We've had the example of Thorpe Hills Village in my constituency, where they're getting planning permission despite it being an unsustainable village. They're getting planning permission for all manner of hundreds and hundreds of houses, and yet we don't have any facilities there. So we'll have to be in the right place. So we're going to build the houses that people want. And of course, they need to be environmentally friendly too. It is a housing crisis, and as we've heard, a climate crisis too. But we can't sacrifice one for the other. It's no good having more houses if they simply contribute to the irreversible damage of the planet. Energy-saving measures and eco-efficiency also bring huge benefits to the residents in cutting bills, reducing consumption and easing fuel poverty. And I was involved in lots of fuel poverty projects about 10 or 15 years ago. Over half of the council and housing associated homes are in APC band C or above. That compared to 27% of private rented and 25% of owner-occupied homes. So all the more reason perhaps to invest in social housing and housing association properties as well. So we will prioritise affordable homes in a new zero carbon homes programme, and I think you might hear more of that this afternoon with all the benefits that bring. And when I think of people on very low incomes going into highly energy efficient homes and the fact that they won't then have the energy bills that some of the rest of us face, it just warms my heart because it means they don't have to choose between eating and heating. We'll also ensure that all council and housing associations reach EPC Band 3. We'll provide funding for insulating existing homes and support councils and housing associations to build new homes to the highest standards. The Warm Zone programme was a fantastic programme around the turn of the century for several years, delivered tremendous things. But you know, what I would say here today is that prior to the 2010 election, the building industry was ready to adopt and deliver much higher standards in terms of build and energy efficiency. But the incoming Lib Dem Tory government actually set aside those new tougher regulations, which means we've actually lost 10 years of actually improved homes. So the many homes that have been built over that period of time, simply not enough, I know, but the ones that have been built could have been built to a much higher standard. So we need to look forward to that. And I think I've been given 4 minutes. I'm probably over that already. So I'm going to finish there, but hopefully we can pick up other issues in the discussion later.
Thank you, Alex. That's a really good summation and to kick us off. Next, I'm going to bring in Nicky Gavron. She's a London Assembly member. She leads on planning on the Assembly and actually became the first statutory Deputy Mayor of London in 2000. And she held that post for 7 years and led on London's response to the climate change. And she's also from Labour Housing Group. Nicky.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Well, if it's okay, I'm going to do 5 minutes. Thank you. I'm absolutely convinced, and I'm going to talk about modular housing, and the reason I'm talking about it is because I'm convinced that it's part of the solution in tackling what I think are 3 crises in the housing sector. The crisis of supply, the crisis of affordability, and the crisis of construction. And if you add to that the climate emergency, then we have a sort of perfect storm. Now, we've never reached the high housing targets we need unless 2 things have come together in the past. And that was councils building homes, and the homes, many of the homes, were prefabricated. Now, Housing for the Many, John Healy's Front Bench's paper, wonderful paper on Housing for the Many, actually promotes both those. And I want to give you an example. I wish I had a slide, but anyway, this is the nearest I can get to it. It's the cover of a report I wrote called Design Sealed Delivered about this. And this is Camden Council house building. It's Backton low rise. It's shoehorned against a railway line, though you can't hear a thing when you're in the homes. And it's 107 council houses, and they were built in 10 weeks. And panels were off-site, they were craned in, and that was craned in, only 14 lorry movements, no noise, no dust, no pollution, meeting our air quality and our low carbon objectives. Now, I have seen examples like this right across London, low-rise, high-rise, small sites, large sites, for students, for families, etc. And they've all been very high quality, digitally designed, precision manufactured in factories, and they're very thermally efficient, and they're very low carbon. And the Bacton tenants were absolutely thrilled. They're very affordable to live in. They were thrilled to find their energy bills, they were the tenants moving in, a regeneration scheme, their energy bills are slashed by £1,000. Imagine £1,000. Imagine what impact that's going to have on fuel poverty if we go on building like this. Now, they're good for all tenures, modular homes, but they are particularly suited to rented homes, from market rent, build to rent, and of course social rent. And the reason for that is because if you invest in it, you need speed of delivery and quick returns. And that's what you get with modular housing. Now, in London, Sadiq's new London plan says he has to find 65,000 homes per year, 30,000 of them to be at social rent. Now, with that kind of demand, we could be a catalyst for jobs and factories right across the country. It's a win-win. Now, he's actually putting modular housing front and centre in his plans, and he's already started them on public land, for 50% of all housing to be affordable. And he's doing that by using his innovation funding, his public land, his planning policy, and also a new digital tool which is going to scale and replicate. I have to tell you about it afterwards. It's called Prism, digitally designed app. So this is the kind of leadership that the industry has been crying out for. But we have to do more. It's not quite enough. What we have to do, in order to scale, we have to have continuity of demand. And that means if we want volume, we need volume. And unless you have that continuity of demand, unless you have that volume, you can't justify the upfront costs, the capital investment for factories and for production. Now, in this way, Labour authorities outside London are leading the way. And I could cite that afterwards, where they're leading the way. But what they're doing is they're aggregating their sites, they're pooling their sites with housing associations, with manufacturers. And that way, they're getting very high quality housing, and they're getting it fast. Now, for instance, here's an example of someone who's doing that. Andy Burnham, in the Combined Manchester Authority, is doing this with housing associations and manufacturers, and he's putting modular at the heart of his industrial strategy. This is not just about housing, his industrial strategy. It's about training. It's about skills. He's working with schools. He's working with colleges. And also, it's about even more than that. It's about jobs for a new generation of younger people. And particularly, it's good for women. Now, Jeremy Corbyn is putting, and I think we'll hear about this tomorrow, is putting... Oh, today, sorry.
Yeah, because it's changed because of Parliament.
Oh, God.
Yeah, so anyway, it's all right, it's all right.
Have I just missed you? Oh,
No,
I
it's
can't.
later on, anyway, carry on.
Sorry, I'm getting very confused. Anyway.
Fast-changing world, really.
Wow. Wow, I was just getting blown into the sea. Anyway, okay. All right, well, anyway, all right, so we know that Jeremy's putting net zero carbon homes as a requirement for all new build. That's absolutely music to all our ears. And it's what Sadiq is already adopted in London, and it's just about to be tried by the government inspector. But that means it's operational carbon. And these homes, of course, are very good on operational carbon. They're often, it's not just that they're thermally so tight, airtight, it's also that, in fact, they're usually fueled by, this one is fueled by waste heat on a decentralised system from the local hospital. But often it's renewable energy as well. But we've got to go even further than that, because we are heading, if we want to avoid what we're heading for, which is 3 degrees rise in global temperatures, then we have to change our building standards, and we have to change the way we build. Modernising the construction sector is a very key part of tackling the climate emergency. But we're on our way right across the country, Labour authorities and Labour are leading on greening homes with modern methods of construction, new jobs, new factories, new skills. And that is, in fact, a central part of the green industrial revolution, which, of course, Labour is going to lead on. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Nicky, and that's really useful to bring out some of the Labour leadership and some of the real benefits that people can get from low-carbon homes. I'm going to bring in Lois Lane now from the Campaign for Rural England, who leads on their work on rural affordable housing and rural land economy.
Thanks, Jake. From the centre of London out into rural England. I was told yesterday, in fact, that there are more people living in rural England than in all of Greater London, which is not something I thought about before, but made an impression on me. And to begin with, I'm going to depart very slightly from what Alex said at the beginning about sustainable villages, because we certainly don't want to see huge numbers of executive homes dumped on greenfields and that to be called fixing the rural housing crisis. But we are absolutely passionate at CPRE about promoting the opportunity of every village to be sustainable. And we mean that in a social sense, and we mean that in an environmental sense. And the amazing thing about small villages is that just a handful of new homes can make a massive difference to whether or not that community can actually have a future. Whether the local school can stay open, whether the local pub can stay open, whether the local shop can stay open. But we know that there is a huge problem with housing affordability in rural areas. At the moment, there's about 170,000 families on the waiting lists for social housing in rural authorities across the country. And last year, we built 1,300 homes for social rent in those areas. So if we carried on building at that rate, it would take 130 years to provide a home for every one of those families. The new homelessness statistics for the fourth quarter have just come out. They showed a rise across the country, huge rise in homelessness. In rural areas, it was 85% from last year. There's 17,000 families that are accepted as homeless in rural authorities. And this is quite a hidden housing crisis because sometimes people living in urban areas, like where I live, tend to think about the countryside as being a place where everyone's very rich and they don't need housing and they certainly don't need council housing. And we know at CPRE that that's very much not the case and that communities will welcome homes if they are homes that they can afford and they meet their needs. And that, of course, means not just the rent level, but it means the costs of heating your home, the costs of getting around from your home. And this is where rural housing affordability intersects really closely with energy efficiency and making sure that rural housing is up to scratch in terms of energy efficiency. And some rural specialist housing associations are really leading the way on this. We work very closely with Hasto Housing Association. They have a fantastic record on energy efficient homes. They've done lots of schemes now to passive house standards, which are like the gold standard of energy efficiency. And the first scheme that they did in Wimbish in Essex, they've done some independent research to see how much it costs to heat those homes, and it's £130 a year that the families in those were spending on energy bills. So these are fantastically energy efficient homes, and we know that rural areas can be a real flagship for those kinds of homes. But most rural stock is not new builds, it's existing stock. A lot of it's very energy inefficient. So we know that retrofitting is a massive challenge across the board, but particularly in rural areas. And our partners at various housing associations we work with have told us that they have homes on their books that would be affordable for families to rent, but they can't get people to let them or to buy them because they know that they wouldn't be able to afford the heating costs. So this is a huge problem, it's a huge challenge. I'm really interested to hear what the FMB have to say on retrofitting, because it's not something I know enough about yet. As well as the actual fabric of the buildings themselves, we need to think about planning for energy efficiency in a holistic way. And this is something that I've heard coming up at many, many sessions over the last few days. It's all very well having a fantastically energy efficient home, even a carbon neutral home. But if you're driving to get to it and there's no public transport options nearby, then your overall carbon footprint is still not going to be brilliant. I live in Roehampton in southwest London at the moment. It's not one of the best connected bits of London, but I can still get to work by bus if I wanted to for £1.50. Where I grew up in West Cumbria, there was no bus service from the village nearest my house. There was a bus service from Keswick, where I went to school, to Cockermouth, which was the next town over. Roughly the same distance as from where I live to work now, and it cost £6.30 for a single journey on that route. So we must invest in rural bus services and actually maybe rebalance a bit of spending away from London and the southeast and to other parts of the country. But buses are crucial. If you're on a low income, you won't be able to afford to live in a remote location if you can't get anywhere, or if the only way that you can get around is to drive, and it doesn't give people those options. And finally, we know that the climate breakdown is not the only environmental crisis we're facing at the moment. There's also a crisis in biodiversity and in species loss and in habitat loss. And one of the things that is happening at the moment, or that's moving towards happening, is that there's going to be a statutory requirement soon for all new developments to achieve biodiversity net gain. And this is very complex, and there's lots of disagreements about how you measure it and what it will mean in practice and all of this, but we know that it will be statutory, and we know that at present affordable housing requirements are not statutory. So with a finite pot of money, if developers are having to make decisions about what they prioritize, and net gain is in law and affordable housing requirements are not, you can guess which one will be squeezed. So public funding is hugely important here. We're delighted to see that Labour's committed to spending a lot more on housing supply funding for genuinely affordable homes. But also, land is hugely important, and the cost of land. We've been part of a coalition of organisations right across the political spectrum who are all calling for reforms to the way that land compensation rules apply, so that at the moment, if a local authority wants to acquire land to carry out an infrastructure project, they have to pay absolute top whack what it would be worth with residential planning permission, even if it's in agricultural use at the moment and worth a lot less. We'd like to see changes to that, the 1961 Land Compensation Act, which is that law, so that local authorities would be able to acquire land more cheaply, master plan developments that are both affordable and that are environmentally friendly, that have walking infrastructure, that have public transport infrastructure, and then sell off plots to a mixture of private developers and SME builders and housing associations, and maybe they want to build some themselves at a much more affordable rate, so that we can actually capture some of that uplift in land value and use it to create homes that people can afford to live in and that won't damage the planet over the long term. Thank you.
Thank you for that, and I think we'll want to tease out some of that those interconnected points about energy and transport and underpinning, and how they're much more connected to delivery of housing now than perhaps those discussions were before. I'm now going to turn to Bryan, the CEO of the Federation of Master Builders. Over to you.
Thank you. Well, good afternoon, and I very much welcome this opportunity to speak on behalf of Britain's small builders. The Federation of Master Builders is a trade body for SME builders all across the UK. We've got 8,000 companies, and 55% of our members get involved in some form of house building. So what they tend to do is dip in and dip out, and they're building typically 4 to 6 houses a year, so they're micro house builders. We were hearing earlier about the housing crisis, because actually housing is a basic right for everyone, and I think we need to remind ourselves of that as we talk about the issue. And it is alarming, I think, when we hear some of the stats. The National Housing Federation have produced a report which came out this week saying that 8.4 million people in this country are living in unaffordable, insecure and unsuitable homes. And when you think about, actually, 1 in 4 children are living in cramped conditions in London, according to Shelter. And actually, if you're trying to get on the housing ladder, the average age in the UK is 34. In London, it's 36. And the affordability ratios now are standing at 7.4 in urban areas, but 8.6 in rural areas, just showing actually about the hidden poverty that we see in the rural areas across this country. So the question is why? Why aren't we building the homes that this country needs? And quite simply, we are not having the political commitment to deliver the number of homes that are required. And I think there are three factors there. In 1945, the Labour government with Nye Bevan were building on average 200,000 homes a year at a time when Britain was on its knees, but there was that political commitment to deliver new homes for a nation that deserved a home when they came back, having learnt the lessons from the First World War. That drive and that commitment is certainly needed in a new Labour government. The second issue is in terms of diversity. The housing market is not a very healthy place if you're an SME builder. Only 23% of homes were built by SME house builders. It is the large house builders that have got their hands on house building in this country. We need to open it up. We need to see more homes built by the councils, housing associations. We need modular homes, self-build. We need to get the SMEs involved. We need to open up the whole supply of housing in this country. And to do that, we need to tackle the barriers that SME house builders face. And we do an annual survey of our members. And the number one issue for our members is the availability of land. At the moment, the planning system only releases large parcels of land, which benefits the larger house builders. We need the local plans to offer microsites where 2 or 3 houses could be built to create a greater diversity and higher standards in house building across this country. The planning system. There's major complaints from our members about the planning system, particularly the under-resourcing of planning departments. The government said actually they recognised the problem and allowed local authorities to increase planning application fees by 20%. And because the situation is so bad, our members were saying, fine, yes, we'll pay the extra because we want to speed it up. But you know, year on, we're not seeing the results of that. And we're calling on the government to do a review because where is that money going? So I think a Labour government would seriously need to look at the resourcing of planning departments in this country if we're going to build the homes that we desperately need. And the last one is access to finance. For the SMEs, they still haven't really recovered from the financial crisis of 10 years ago. They need greater funding and support from government to underpin development if we're going to get that sea change that we want in house building across the UK. Now, earlier it was mentioned about construction and the environment. And we've been talking about new build and a commitment to zero carbon, which is absolutely fantastic. But 85% of our buildings will still be in use in the year 2050. If we are serious about tackling climate change, we need to actually improve the quality of our existing building stock. 40% of carbon emissions come from our buildings. We need a national retrofit strategy to actually tackle that. And the Green Deal that we saw, some of you may remember, under the coalition government, was an absolutely dismal failure, partly because the government wasn't listening to the industry. It was too expensive and no one was going to take it up. We need that vision, we need that commitment, we need that drive from a new Labour government to actually say we will improve people's lives and we will tackle fuel poverty, we will tackle climate change and we will drive up standards in the building industry to deliver homes that people deserve. And that finally brings me on to my final point about the skills crisis. You've got to have people to build the homes that we want. And at the moment, we are suffering from a shortage of people coming into the building industry. We've got a role to play there to make it more attractive, to attract more women into our sector. But we also need to see a change in the dialogue by actually saying to do an apprenticeship is a good thing to be doing. It's not all about going to university, and giving opportunities to people to come back into our industry and provide the financial mechanisms to enable people to do that. And the last bit is, did you know that anyone can call themselves a builder in this country? All of us could go out this afternoon and call ourselves builders and start selling our services. I wouldn't recommend it, and I certainly won't be doing it myself. But the issue is, of course, it's not right that homeowners in particular are paying thousands, tens of thousands of pounds on doing up their homes, and then we hear the stories about cowboy builders, we see the programs on TV. It becomes a form of entertainment. We need a licensing system for our building companies to knock out the cowboy builders, to protect the consumer, to increase the revenue to government, and to actually drive up the standards. There's a lot to do, and I hope the Labour government will be taking it on board.
Thank you, Bryan, and I know that in politics we often say about building a better Britain, so I'm not sure how we can... Politicians use that quite a lot, you know. Anyway, I'm going to move on to Helen Hayes. She sits on the Housing, Communities and Local Government Select Committee, and she's Vice Chair of the All-Party Group for the Built Environment, Housing and Planning, and before that was actually a town planner. So, over to you.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Jake. It's great to be here this afternoon. I feel like I should apologise to a couple of people who've heard me speak already today for what may be some slight repetition of things that you might have heard before. So please bear with me. I just want to start by saying that we face a housing crisis unprecedented since the Second World War, and we face a climate emergency. The housing crisis is an issue of profound social justice, and so is the climate emergency. And so for us as the Labour Party, these are both core concerns that have to be absolutely front and centre of our programme for government. And it is great to see the debates that are going on those issues in the main hall, and some of the resolutions that are being approved, and in particular some really big commitments around the climate emergency. But this is not new. We've known about both the housing crisis and the climate emergency for a long, long time. And for me, this is an issue that's personal. As Jake mentioned, I worked as a town planner for nearly 20 years before I was elected to Parliament in 2015. For 2 of those years, between 2006 and 2008, I worked on a project for CABE, the Commission for Architecture and the Built Environment, on a project called Sustainable Places, which was about everything to do with the connection between the built environment and climate change. And personally, that was a kind of life-changing project. It shifted my thinking on climate change from being an area that I'd always been interested in and concerned about, and signed up to Friends of the Earth at the age of 14. It'd always been important to me. But it shifted my thinking to think of climate change as the prism through which we need to see all of our policy making. And I think that was the case for everybody that worked on that project at the time. And it was a huge, great online resource. We had experts from all over the world writing for us about the approaches that different cities were taking to tackling climate change through their built environment. We were taking it out. It had kind of training. We were training people in the industry. We were training people in local authorities to think differently about climate change in the built environment. And it really felt, for all of us who were involved, that we were on the cusp of making a huge step change in progress on this issue. And of course, we had a Labour government at that time who was introducing the zero carbon homes standard, who was regulating across planning to improve the standard of what was being built, and to really think about design, think about sustainability at the heart of planning. And of course, what happened is that in 2010, the Tories and the Lib Dems archived that project, and it's still sitting there in a very sad and non-interactive way online on the National Archive. But we should be talking now about 10 years of progress and what more we need to do to build on it. We should not be revisiting policies that were perfectly well articulated 10 years ago and working out how now, in the context of an even more urgent situation, we can rapidly introduce them. But I would say, we are where we are, and now we need that commitment. And for me, that involves, as the Labour Party, as absolutely grabbing hold of the planning system as a tool for delivering social justice. Planning is a progressive profession. It is fundamentally about saving resources, safeguarding resources, whether that's land or housing or infrastructure, for things that deliver for the common good. And so it is a progressive toolkit at our disposal, and we need to grab hold of it. We need to resource it properly. We need to ensure that there are robust standards applying across building control and across planning decision making. And what I would say about industry is that the built environment professions are very, very regulation responsive. You know, the industry was as cross as anybody when the government cancelled the Zero Carbon Homes programme, because they'd all done their research and development and were geared up to deliver on it, and that was just a waste. So this is an area where regulation, strong regulation, really can deliver. And then the other bit of it is that we need to be engaging communities. And it's my experience that, you know, this tremendous movement that we have now around the climate emergency is a powerful hook for engaging people also in addressing the housing crisis, and delivering places which are sustainable in every possible sense. And when we were working on the Sustainable Places project, we were talking about energy, about waste, about water, about biodiversity, about green infrastructure, about transport and connectivity, and you know, all of those things to plan places that aren't just filled with soulless housing units, but are filled with homes and which make up communities. And that needs to be at the heart of what we do. Other people have mentioned retrofitting, and I'd just say a very, very quick word on that to highlight how important it is. 14% of carbon emissions in this country come from residential buildings. In order to achieve net zero, we need to almost eliminate carbon emissions from residential buildings. So that just gives a scale of the challenge. We're talking about doing that by 2030. We need the biggest programme of retrofitting that can possibly be imagined. And we're nowhere near that under this government now. And we need to start it immediately, and it needs to be systematically rolled out. And it needs to, you know, engage people who are privately renting and homeowners and the social housing sector, because we won't deliver net zero without it. And then finally, I just mentioned the cost of land. So we have, and I just mentioned an example, that, and again, forgive me if you heard me speak on this earlier. We have the way that the land market works in this country allows landowners to profit from entirely speculative value that is not the consequence of any investment on their part, is not the consequence of any talent on their behalf, does not require them to do anything. And an illustration of that is a site in Southwark, not in my constituency, in the other part of Southwark, which was a disused retail site with an existing use value of £5 million, put on the market for auction at £25 million. Later withdrawn from auction because the landowner thought he could get even more by holding out for a bit longer. We have a land market system in this country which prioritises the right of one individual private organisation to a windfall profit of £20 million over and above the community of Southwark to genuinely affordable social housing. And that needs to change, because that is also a profound issue of social justice. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen. And I echo your point around the zero carbon homes. I was in government at the time, I'm a special advisor, and we took that forward. And I was actually at an event last year with Claire Perry, who was proudly announcing the government's targets on this, and actually exactly that point you made about the lack of investment. Some housing people from the housing profession are saying, look, we geared up all of this. You know, we invested in this, and then you went and cancelled it. So it's very much it's a very profound point, and it should not be forgotten. And she didn't answer the question, and she just ignored it. Anyway, that's the commitment we sometimes see for government to these things. So I'm going to open this up to questions, but I just wanted to pick on one point first before I do that, and I'll take it in. I'll take them in threes. But I did want to ask Alex in a way. We heard some issues around connectedness, and energy is really important, transport's really important, obviously planning is as well, but there's a range of those areas. How much are you talking with your colleagues to create a unified plan and joining up those silos, which perhaps we used to have a lot more, and we need to address?
Yeah, well, I mean, silo working is the way that we've seen have done business for decades, and it's absolutely critical we get this right. But there was one of our colleagues referred to planning departments and capacity. Local authorities simply don't have the capacity anymore to work more, with planners or developers that simply don't exist. Most of the expertise now rests in housing associations and with private builders, so we need to actually address that resource for local authorities first and foremost. We've also then got to think in terms of our local plans fit for purpose. I've seen a situation in my own constituency. I referred earlier to the village of Thorpe Thewles, which isn't just getting 2 or 3 houses, it's getting 200 or 300 houses, despite the fact it only has 1 pub, no shop, no doctor's provision, no school, no nothing else. So we've got to really get that right and make sure that the local plans as they come in are fit for purpose. So we're all talking now about how do we provide the right regulations. Is it a case of bringing back the 2008 material and just building a little on that, or do we have to do something much more comprehensive?
Okay, thanks, sir. So I will start at the back and I'll work down like this. So person there, right at the back. If that's all right. Oh, sorry, I've just made you run all the way down there. Sorry about that. Yeah, do you want to start?
Hi everyone, Ingrid Allen, delegate and SERA representative for Worthing West. I was just wondering, it's great to hear so much talk of retrofitting because it is going to be a huge problem, and my deepest sympathies go out to all those young homeowners that won't get on the ladder until they're over 30. Until recently I thought I would be one of them, but there are a sizable population of people who, they've put all of their life savings into buying their first house or flat. They've not got any money to make it more energy efficient. They've bought with friends, or in my case, they found out that the landlord wanted to sell it from under them and taken a gamble. And most of them, would really like to make their homes more energy efficient. So which incentives would be offered by a future Labour government to, help them achieve that goal?
Okay, that's great. And then I'll take, just there.
You mentioned that anyone can set up as a builder. Can you hear me? Sorry. You mentioned that anyone can set up as a builder, so I assume there is no code of ethics or anything like it to be a builder. How do you think this came about? What led to that situation, that anyone, tomorrow, can just set up?
So hold that thought. We're going to, and this question here.
Hi, Claire Neely, Dulwich and West Norwood. Helen's my MP, which is delightful. If you have I'm very pleased that the CPRE mentioned rural transport. Do give my regards to Ray Smith. And if you've paid for your car, you've paid for your controlled parking zone, and you then drive to the supermarket, unlike your neighbour who is on a low income and doesn't have access to a car. So will the Labour government be enforcing charging for supermarket parking and workplace parking to reduce the amount of land that is used for car parking, and to reduce the transport inequality between people who have access to a car and the people on the low, and who are generally in the highest incomes and drive the most, and people on the lowest incomes who don't have access to a car, even, as the woman from CPRE said, in rural areas?
Right, and I'll come back for some other questions as well. So on retrofitting, do you want to take that, Alex? And also I was going to say, there may be, Nicky might want to come back on whether there's a London perspective on this from the yeah, and you can mention that. Okay.
There's no doubt about it that that's what we actually need. We need these comprehensive programs. And the warm zone programs from '99, I think they lasted for about 10 or 12 years, where there was a systematic move from property to property, street to street, actually identifying what was needed across all sectors, and then using the energy commitment money from the energy companies, which are collected from, energy customers. It's not a donation from the energy companies. It's collected from the customer, and that money was then used in order to do that. And I think we need to look at how we get better value out of all of that, And for me, part of that is actually maybe putting more responsibility with local authorities to control that money, have the energy companies pick the money up from their customers and pass it over to local authorities for them to do the work, because at the moment, energy companies actually make a margin off that money that they collect on behalf of energy efficiency measures. As far as young people is concerned, that's where the money should be going. I believe that we should see the money, that's raised in that particular way invested there. But of course, there's a commitment from the Labour Party to do things much more comprehensively, and it may well be we'll see tax money, and I think it was £1 billion was mentioned, actually going to programmes as well.
I'd just say, well, Sadiq has a programme for retrofitting programmes called retrofitting houses called Renew, but we're very adamant in London that we need much more government action, and it's really good to hear what we're hearing from Alex about the fact that we're going to really push on the PRS, but we do need to go much further, and I think we need to take a leaf out of the 56 Clean Air Act when we had smokeless zones, and I don't know how many people know about that, but I mean, it was because of the smog, but citizens didn't breathe easy. But within 3 years, that was a Tory government, they changed every single appliance in a home, and they went zone by zone. I think we should have low carbon zones. We should really work on exactly what you're saying, actually, Alex, but we should go area by area. We should give the money to the local authorities, but street by street, house by house. And for those communities that are ready for it, go there first, but put on notice that it'll come later. And I think that way, we've got to work out the financing of it, but I think there is a way that we could actually join up what you were saying and what Alex was saying in terms of retrofitting.
And do you want to...
Yeah, I just want to pick up on that, because 11 years ago, the Federation did a report called Building a Greener Britain. So we were talking about this 11 years ago, and we do need a national strategy to tackle our existing building stock. And the question was actually what incentives are needed. And I think one incentive would be to reduce the rate of VAT on repair and maintenance. At the moment, it's 20% if you want to improve your home. And if you're building a new property, it's 0. So there's an imbalance there. So that needs to be looked at. And also council tax, there ought to be some sort of reduction there if you're upgrading your home to make it more energy efficient. So those are two practical examples about what a Labour government could do to improve energy efficiency of our building stock.
And did you want to pick up a question that was directed to you?
Yes, the builder. That's a very good question, because I think it's become overlooked. The trades are regulated to some extent because of competent person schemes, but the general builder has just been left. And I think it's been overlooked, and then under Conservative governments, they don't want any more regulation. Now is the time, because if we're going to retrofit, who's going to do that work? They need to be qualified or experienced in some form. Otherwise, we could have a disaster on our hands when we've got a strategy, but no one suitably qualified to do the work. So that's why licensing, regulated by the industry itself, paying for itself at no cost to the taxpayer, I think it is the immediate solution to actually raising standards, and that would help to get a wider cross-section of people coming into our industry, and also provide redress for consumers who have nowhere to go really if things go wrong, because too often cowboy builders escape. Well, I don't know, society, I suppose. I mean, that's why we're acting as the champions for licensing. We're working with the industry. We've got a task force set up, and we'll be calling on politicians of all colours. So it should be a non-party political issue, really. So yes, a bit late in the day, but we are on the case.
And then, yeah, and I was coming to your point. I'm trying to make sure. So on that transport point and the inequality, it was partly directed at what's the Labour position, but I also want to bring in Lois and maybe Helen on that as well, and then I'll come to Alex.
Just briefly on that. Ooh, is my microphone working? Good. Sorry, hard to tell from here. Thanks for the point about car parking. I think it's hugely important, and it is something which, obviously, any new settlement across the country and existing settlements, you see acres and acres of space devoted to car parking that is horribly ill-used land, and it's, as Helen said, land is a finite resource. We have to be using it better. One thing that I think is a really interesting avenue about this that we've been kind of kicking around at CPRE for years because it's so very complex, is the idea of having a national land use strategy, which would actually be, and I'm aware we're calling for strategies for all sorts of things, but a framework for how we use land well. Because at the moment, we don't have that. We don't have any overarching sense of what constitutes a good use of land, or of the prioritization that should be given to housing, to transport infrastructure, to farming land, to land that might need to be rewilded to improve carbon capture. And a national land use strategy, possibly coupled with some sort of taxation measures, but that's a bit ambitious potentially, would be a really good way to just actually set out how a future Labour government sees the different uses of land as fitting together and working. And I'm sure if we had one of those, we'd see an awful lot less car parking space around new developments.
And Helen, did you?
Yeah, I mean, I it's for Alex to answer the direct question. I think that's above my pay grade. But I mean, I think we are on a trajectory that is about a major transition with regard to transport, and that, you know, I see that in my own constituency with the, you know, in lots of different ways, with some quite often quite contested conversations, as you know, Claire, about cycling infrastructure and CPZs and the like. But I think it's only moving in one direction, you know, which is to say that petrol and diesel-driven cars are the transport of the past, and clean, sustainable transport and active travel are the transport of the future. But that isn't to say that in each and every community there's not a complex conversation to be had, and it's a balance of giving people alternatives and access to real and appropriate and accessible alternatives at the same time as the disincentives, at the same time as the regulation. It's all, you know, all of those things together.
And just before I bring in, I just wanted to say as well on the point you made, Labour did have regional spatial strategies, and again I was in there at the time. The Conservatives, you know, campaigned against it and then scrapped them. And part of that now they would have probably need to be reformed and move forward to some of the issues we're talking about now, and zero carbon and whatever. But that was a model which the Conservatives, and then again you hear Conservatives say, oh, why isn't there housing being brought forward? Why isn't this happening? Those decisions had implications.
Yes, I was a member of the North East RDA, Regional Development Agency, and we were responsible for doing some of that work. So it was we were having large areas of land that we're parcelling them together, negotiating with people to put one parcel together for all manner of development, housing and other things as well. So yes, most certainly, I think we need to be back in that direction in order to do that. I mean, we're talking about in terms of a sovereign land trust, in the hope that that can do some of the things that have been outlined here. To answer the question directly, I and nobody else is going to give a direct commitment to start charging for supermarket and workplace parking. I would say to you and tell you that 5 villages in my constituency lost their only 4 times a day bus service just a few weeks ago. The X22, for those of you who are really into buses. And it means that if I was to start advocating things like this, why should I be punishing them because of our failure as a society to provide sustainable transport? So I think we need to be looking forward to this. We need to be talking, what is the role of the elected mayors? What are the roles of combined authorities to look across wider areas and look very specifically about, you know, strategic bus and other public transport. If you live in London and, you know, I stand at the bus stop and I hear people moan because the bus is more than 30 seconds late. If you stand on Stockton High Street, the bus might not bother coming, particularly if you're going out to the rural areas. So if we could have more integrated transport, I think that's the answer, but we need to give those powers and the resource to combined authorities if we're going to deliver it. Then we can start looking at charging people to, you know, to park their car at work.
I'm pretty sure that Labour's going to copy the London model and re-regulate the buses outside London, surely. Let's hope so. I mean, it really makes a huge difference because we're very fortunate in London. But even in the suburbs of London, we have a lot in common with other places because there are lots of people who still have cars because we haven't yet diversified the bus offer, and we absolutely have to crack bus provision outside London. And from everything I'm hearing on the National Policy Forum, Labour's going to tackle that.
And that's right. So I'm going to open it up a few more questions. Oh, God, there's a lot more questions. Right, there was a question already before, and I'll work back, and maybe I'll take 4 this time together, okay?
Hi, I'm Leslie. Can you hear? I'm Leslie Rudd. I'm the Chief Executive of the Sustainable Energy Association. My questions are for Alex mainly. So in 2002, I successfully campaigned for VAT to be reduced on energy saving measures. Can you hear? Yeah. So VAT is 5% on fuel. Can you hear me now?
Oh, yes, that's,
yeah?
That's better. Yeah, I could hear, but yeah, Alex couldn't, yeah.
Right, okay. So in 2002, it was introduced 5% VAT on energy saving measures, which includes insulation and things like that, after a campaign for that, because it was 5% on fuel itself, and it was 17.5 at the time on those. So that was successful. That's been in place ever since, but it's being reversed in October. So as from October, VAT on things like heat pumps and insulation, which we obviously need if we're going to save the climate crisis, are going to go up to 20%. So question is, would the Labour government reverse that? And also on energy company obligation, which you mentioned earlier, you were talking about the funding coming from the energy suppliers, from customers' bills, which is not particularly progressive. Would that not be better coming from generally from general taxation? So would you change that?
Okay, and I'll just take, as I said, I'll take these questions. These 2 people here, yeah? Yeah, sorry. You can
David Hendy from Mace. Given ageing demographics in the workforce, in construction, we reckon we need to hire about 1 million more people by 2024, and that's without building 1 million new homes and the largest retrofitting programme imaginable, both of which I'm very supportive of. So the sector's already on terribly low margins. How do the panel think we can do all this, and how do the panel think we can address that skill shortage to make this a reality?
Okay.
Leo Chapman, Guildford, CLP. If Labour policy focused on council housing rather than affordable housing, would the increased supply lead to a fall in the cost of existing housing, therefore tackling the extortionate prices of housing, and as well as housing those who need it the most?
Okay, and I might actually take 1 more because we've got about just over 10 minutes left, and so then we can get a big range of questions. Okay. Last question there, sorry.
Hello, Jane Cropper, West Worthing, CLP. Why don't the Labour government adopt a policy of building more terraces, which we get greater density rather than detached buildings, and also go away from building high-rise flats all the time, which aren't environmentally friendly?
Okay, thank you. There are quite a range of questions there. So, hope everyone remembered it. We're having so many, it's a bit harder, but I hopefully made a note and we'll try and pick it up. So let's try and probably go in the order that it was asked in. The increase in VAT and also on solar panels as well. Yeah, it's unbelievable. But
well, a few minutes ago, you had Helen talk about something being above her pay grade. This is particularly above my pay grade. This is a matter really for the Treasury. But given Labour's commitment around all the other energy efficiency, measures and investment in it, I would think that that would be an area which we would be looking at very, very seriously. It's no good providing the money from one hand and taking it with another. So I would hope to see that happen. I saw lots of firms in my area go out of business as a direct result of some of the changes that we've seen before this change in taxation, and we need to do more in order to build those companies up to provide the goods that are required. As far as skills are concerned, it's a major crisis. We can't attract young people into the industry despite the fact it pays well. But when you look at the new modular factories, the new generation of skills and things, I think that's something where we can actually encourage more young people into it. I'm told that lots of unemployed young people in London, and yet we can't get them into the industry. But we've also got to ensure that developers fulfil their obligation to recruit apprentices and young apprentices and older apprentices as well, to ensure that the job is done and that we build that workforce for the future. But it's this new workforce, and one of my colleagues talked very specifically about that earlier. And the other one, I think I can leave that to others.
Okay. Yeah, I was going to say, Helen, is it something that you could, you're able to raise on the select committees on why is the government and sort of raising these issues on the select committee? Because the more we can raise awareness of this stupidity,
Yeah.
That's a potential.
No, certainly, and we do. Can't vouch for the quality of the response that we get from the government on the select committee, but can I just say a word about skills?
Yeah.
And I think this is a really interesting conundrum about why the construction sector finds it so difficult to recruit. It is also a sector that will take an enormous hit as a consequence of Brexit and is already being very detrimentally affected as a consequence of Brexit. And the kind of, while some of the Tories will, talk about recruiting young British people to go into construction, that the reality is that is a major challenge, and this is a sector that is very, very reliant on the skills from Europe to resource it. We did a visit with the select committee. We did, just going back to what Nicky was saying about modular homes, we did a visit to a factory in Essex, which is kind of only a couple of years old, and building modular housing there. And they identified, they were saying they had, for until very recently, they'd had a really big recruitment problem. And they thought that it was in part about people locally not really understanding what they were, because they're sort of construction, but they're sort of manufacturing. And a lot of the skills are the same skills. It's joinery, it's electricians, it's plumbers, it's people with traditional construction skills, but working in a modern factory environment. And they said that their recruitment situation had got much better just recently, because they thought that there were now enough people living locally who were talking to their friends and their neighbours and their kids and their nephews and nieces, and getting the word out that this was actually a really good place to work, and being able to explain more kind of what it is. But I think there's also a problem about the state of further education in this country, and that one of the most hit areas of our education sector by austerity, and absolutely at the moment in no way in a fit state to deliver on a kind of major drive for the skills that we need into the sector. So there's nothing about this, that bit that is not challenging, but it is absolutely something that we need to do.
And Bryan just wanted to come on skills.
Well, yes, I mentioned skills when I was speaking earlier, and there are two things I think we need to address. The first one is to develop homegrown talent. We need to actually remove that stigma about using your hands and develop quality apprenticeships. 2/3 of all apprentices in construction are trained by the SMEs. Oh, right, okay, very well, thank you for that helpful interjection. So we need to actually, we need more support for vocational training and apprenticeships, and we as an industry need to tackle the image problem. The second issue is about migration. The government has wanting to reduce the number of migrants coming into 100,000 or below, but 9% of construction workers in the UK are from the EU. And if we stop immediately, what is already a bad crisis in the building industry will become far, far worse. So we need a more flexible approach to immigration, because we do need workers coming in at the same time as we develop homegrown talent. So we need to address that going forward, because there's got to be a sensible debate about having people with the right skills coming into this country.
I've got my. Just to say that Tony Pidgley of Berkeley Homes was telling me that on his workforce, 25% were from the EU and 47% were from the wider area of Europe. I think one of the biggest, so I endorse absolutely everything that's been said. We've got to tackle the immigration issue too. But I think the central issue about the construction industry is, in terms of its workforce, is that it's aging, and we're not attracting new young recruits, or we haven't been. And that's why one of the reasons I said we've got this triple crisis: affordability, supply, and construction. And it really is a crisis. And that's why, Andy Burnham has made modular, absolutely central in his national strategy. And that's why he's actually going out to schools and to colleges and talking about modular and talking about new ways of building. We have to modernise the construction industry. I really recommend anyone who's interested reads Mark Farmer's seminal report for the government called Modernise or Die. It's about the construction industry.
Can I just say that actually Mark Farmer's report is very good about looking to the future, but it doesn't say anything about traditional skills, which are going to be needed to maintain our existing building stock. And we should take great pride in our trades because we're going to need them to maintain Britain's heritage.
I totally agree with that too. But we need to be able to do both, don't we?
Well, yeah, but let's hear a bit more about the tradespeople as opposed to the modern bits.
All right.
And then I'm also conscious that there was a question about terraces. Hopefully someone's going to...
Right, good.
There was a really good point that the colleague from Guildford also raised around the need for affordable council housing.
On terraces, yes, completely agree. They're more energy efficient, they're a good use of space, and people like them. They look nice. They bring communities on board with new developments. And actually, I think this is an area where this isn't even something where it's a case of waiting for a change of government. There is a cross-party consensus at the moment that the aesthetics of what we're building at the moment, particularly what the major house builders are building at the moment, aren't what people like. And we know this. The former housing minister, Kit Malthouse, talks all the time about talked about the fact that he wanted the things we're building now to be the conservation areas of the future, and people slightly raised eyebrows about it. But it's, yes, I think this is something where there is really scope on design and layout of developments to actually see changes now, straight away. And communities can help with that by getting involved early with local plans, by organising to produce design guides that they can then give to local planning authorities, essentially doing as much of the legwork yourself as you can. But it's something where you can have more influence and more leverage than perhaps you can over numbers or over affordability. And just on the social housing issue, I'm not an economist. I don't know what the effect on house prices would be of significantly increasing the supply of council and housing association homes for social rent. But one thing that we do know is that we absolutely need to decouple the supply of affordable homes and social rented homes from market homes. At the moment, the vast majority of social rented homes that are being built through cross-subsidy from market homes. If we leave on the 31st of October with no deal, there's likely to be a housing market crash. The social sector isn't insulated from that at the moment because it's too reliant on the private sector, and we need more public money available, because even if house prices fall significantly, there will still be huge numbers of people who will never be able to afford to buy their own home, and they need a decent, secure place to live. And so we need public money to be paying for that, as it did for generations in the past.
Well, we'll certainly be delivering extra money as far as the social housing sector is concerned. Currently, I think it's 1.6 billion now, and that will go back to the 2010 level of 4 billion. I recognise that that's we've had 10 years since, there's inflation and everything else there, but that is actually a firm spending commitment in order to build more affordable houses for rent. So that's very clear. As for terraces, I would personally be in favour of them. Some of my best and happiest communities are places where there are terrace properties. So I always say, we should be building communities, not estates. And so it's very important to look at that. But it boils down to something I think most of us have talked about today, and that is land. And the availability of land, and whilst there are plenty of brownfield sites across the country, they're not being used the way they should be, and I'd like to see them brought in. But as far as acquiring land is in future, we've got to get to the position where, and this is now policy, where we can arrest the cost of land so that we go back to the original cost of the land when it's designated, whether the local authority buy it and hold it and then sell the building rights as opposed to the land in order to contain the prices, the added cost of land to building. I think that's where we need to be, and that's where we're determined to go.
Thank you for that. And I think we've drawn to the end there. I just wanted to also say we've got housing development vehicles that councils are setting up to deliver those, and that's great, and more homes are coming through. But interestingly, we also, I think, need to always make the challenge. I've had conversations with some of them, and the move towards green homes wasn't as, it was considered a nice to have, not an essential part, and the debate is changing all the time. This is part of the debate we're having today, and it's incumbent on all of us to make sure we are driving those, not just those homes, but the greenest homes, and we've heard all the benefits that they would come from. Thank you, everyone, for coming today and being such a great audience. And yeah, that concludes it. And thank you for all the speakers. If you like, a round of applause for them.